Dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and gold as Alexander Drake stood at the edge of the tarmac, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 45, he had earned every silver streak in his dark hair, every line etched into his face by countless hours in the sky. Drake Flight Academy was his kingdom, his reputation drawing the most ambitious pilots from across the country. The morning air bit at his skin as he conducted his routine pre-flight checks, his movements precise and measured. 23 years of instructing had taught him every nuance of flight, every whisper of wind across wings. His students called him demanding, relentless, even cruel. But his results were undeniable. He was the best instructor on the East Coast, and he made sure every student either met his standards or left. The early October chill clung to the runway as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the pristine aircraft lined up like soldiers at attention. Alexander's domain was a testament to perfection. Not a single bolt out of place, not one procedure overlooked. Yet lately, something felt empty about his precisely ordered world. The sound of heels clicking against concrete drew his attention. He turned to find a young woman approaching, her dark hair caught in the morning breeze. She moved with natural grace, purpose in every step. "Mr. Drake." Her voice carried across the tarmac, confident and clear. "I'm Aria Mitchell, your 9 o'clock appointment." Alexander's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. She couldn't have been more than 23, dressed in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks, her pilot's license pinned professionally to her lapel. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep brown with flecks of gold, fierce with determination and something else he couldn't quite name. "Follow me to my office," he managed, his professional mask sliding into place despite the unexpected jolt her presence had caused. The walk to his office felt longer than usual, his awareness of her following behind acute and unsettling. His office was a shrine to aviation, walls lined with certificates, models of aircraft he'd mastered, photographs of successful students. Aria took it all in with obvious appreciation as she settled into the chair across from his desk. "Your application is impressive," Alexander began, opening her file. "Private pilot's license at 19, instrument rating completed last year, perfect score on your written exams." He looked up, meeting those striking eyes. "Why Drake Academy?" "Because you're the best," she answered without hesitation. "And I don't settle for second best." The corner of her mouth curved up slightly, a hint of challenge in her expression. Alexander found himself leaning forward slightly. "Flying isn't just about technical skill, Ms. Mitchell. It's about instinct, judgment, the ability to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death." "Then test me," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I'm ready for anything." The air in the office seemed to grow thicker. Alexander stood, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the strange tension coursing through him. "Very well. Let's see what you can do in the air." The walk to the aircraft was silent, charged with unspoken energy. Alexander watched as Aria performed her pre-flight check, her movements confident, precise, mirroring his own standards of perfection. She climbed into the cockpit with practiced ease, and as he settled into the instructor's seat beside her, the close quarters suddenly felt electric. "Show me what you can do," he instructed, his voice rougher than intended. Aria's hands moved across the controls with natural grace. The engine roared to life, and as they began their taxi, Alexander noticed her small smile of pure joy. The takeoff was flawless, smooth, controlled, perfect. As they climbed into the morning sky, sunshine streaming through the cockpit windows, Alexander found himself more focused on the way her hands caressed the controls than the actual flight path. Her every movement spoke of natural talent, an intuitive understanding of flight that couldn't be taught. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked suddenly, breaking protocol. "The way the aircraft responds, like it's part of you." "Focus on your heading," he replied automatically, but his pulse had quickened. He did feel it, not just the flight, but something dangerous and thrilling building in that small cockpit. Aria executed every maneuver with fluid precision, anticipating his instructions before he gave them. Their bodies swayed in unconscious synchronization with each turn, each adjustment. The usual space between instructor and student seemed to evaporate with each passing moment. As they began their descent, sun now high in the morning sky, Alexander realized his hands were clenched tight on his armrests. Not from concern over her abilities, she was perhaps the most natural pilot he'd ever seen, but from the effort of maintaining his professional distance in the face of their inexplicable connection. They touched down with perfect precision, the wheels kissing the runway with barely a bump. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Aria turned to him, her eyes bright with exhilaration. A few strands of hair escaped from her neat ponytail. "Well, Mr. Drake," she asked, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Do I meet your standards?" Alexander met her gaze, the morning sun casting shadows across her features. "We'll begin regular lessons tomorrow," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Be here at dawn." As she climbed out of the cockpit, Alexander remained seated, his heart racing with something that had nothing to do with flight. He watched her walk away, knowing with certainty that everything in his carefully controlled world was about to change. Days blurred into weeks at Drake Academy, each dawn bringing Aria and Alexander closer together in ways that went far beyond instruction. He found himself scheduling extra training sessions, extending their flights well into the evening hours. Their time in the cockpit became charged with unspoken desire, each slight movement, each shared glance, building an electricity that threatened to ignite. Other instructors began to notice. Whispers followed them across the tarmac. The way Alexander's eyes tracked her movements, how Aria seemed to glow under his attention. Their training sessions grew longer, their debriefings more intimate, conducted behind closed office doors as sunset painted the sky in passionate shades of red and gold. "Your technique is perfect," Alexander murmured during one such session, standing too close as they reviewed her flight logs. The office felt smaller every time they were alone together, the air heavy with possibility. "But there's always more to learn." Aria looked up at him, her eyes holding that challenge that drove him mad. "Then teach me everything," she whispered, her words carrying dangerous implications. The Academy's most senior instructor, David, pulled Alexander aside one morning. "You're playing with fire, Drake," he warned. "I see how you look at her." "She's my best student," Alexander replied coldly, but his hands clenched at his sides. "Is that all she is?" The question haunted him through each lesson, each moment alone with her in the sky. His professional walls were crumbling, and he knew it. But nothing could have prepared him for that storm-swept night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine evening training flight, practicing instrument navigation in darkening conditions. The weather report had promised clear skies, but nature had other plans. The storm rolled in from the coast with devastating speed, turning the peaceful dusk into a maelstrom of wind and rain. "We need to set down," Alexander commanded, watching the lightning illuminate the clouds around them. "There's a small airstrip 20 miles south." Aria handled the aircraft masterfully through the turbulence, her concentration absolute as rain lashed against the windscreen. They descended through the chaos, the small runway appearing like a beacon in the darkness. Her landing was perfect despite the crosswinds. She made the aircraft dance to her will. But the storm had only begun. The small airstrip office was locked, leaving them with only the cockpit for shelter as thunder shook the sky above. Lightning flashed, illuminating Aria's face in brilliant bursts, her eyes wide with lingering adrenaline. "You were magnificent up there," Alexander said softly, their shoulders touching in the confined space. "I've never seen anyone fly like that." "I had a good teacher," she replied, turning to face him. A drop of rain had escaped down her neck, and his eyes followed its path. "It's more than teaching." His voice was rough. "You have something rare, something natural. You were born to fly." The thunder growled overhead, but neither of them noticed. The space between them had disappeared, the warmth of their bodies merging in the storm-darkened cockpit. Aria's hand found his arm, her touch electric even through his sleeve. "Alexander," she breathed, and it was the first time she'd used his first name. Her lips were inches from his, her breath warm against his skin. The lightning flashed again, breaking the spell. Alexander pulled back sharply, his heart thundering louder than the storm. "We should check the weather radar," he said hoarsely, but his hands were shaking. The storm passed eventually, leaving them to fly back to the academy in charged silence. But something had shifted irreversibly. The almost kiss hung between them like an unspoken promise, making every subsequent interaction a sweet torture. Word spread quickly through the academy about their night stranded in the storm. Speculation ran wild, fueled by the obvious tension between them. Alexander caught snippets of conversation that fell silent as he passed, saw the knowing looks from other instructors. Their next training session crackled with intensity. Every movement in the cockpit became an excuse for contact, every instruction an intimate whisper. During the pre-flight check, Aria's hand brushed his as they inspected the wing flaps, and Alexander felt the touch burn through his entire body. "We need to maintain professional boundaries," he said during their debriefing, but he had backed her against his desk, his hands planted on either side of her. "Is that what you really want?" Aria challenged, tilting her face up to his. The setting sun through his office window set her skin ablaze, her eyes dark with desire. Alexander knew they were at the point of no return. Every rational thought, every professional boundary, every carefully constructed wall was crumbling in the face of their overwhelming attraction. The Academy's whispers, his reputation, the consequences, none of it mattered in that moment. "No," he growled, and finally, inevitably, their lips met in a kiss that shattered every pretense of restraint. That first kiss in Alexander's office shattered every boundary. Files scattered across the floor as he pushed Aria against his desk, her fingers digging into his shoulders, drawing him closer. Months of tension exploded into raw passion, consuming them both. "We shouldn't," he gasped against her mouth, even as his hands slid beneath her flight jacket. "I don't care," she breathed. "I need this. I need you." Their secret meetings began immediately, hidden corners of hangars, remote areas of the airfield after hours, his office with blinds drawn tight. Every stolen moment was electric, their professional facade during the day making their encounters more intoxicating. During training flights, Aria would deliberately brush against him during pre-flight checks, her touch lingering. In the cockpit, she'd execute perfect maneuvers while letting her hand rest on his thigh, driving him wild. Late-night flights became their escape. Under star-filled skies, they'd take off into darkness, the intimacy of the cockpit their private world. They'd land at remote airstrips, passion echoing across empty runways. Each encounter grew more intense, more possessive. Within weeks, Alexander began tracking her movements, needing to know where she was every moment. He rescheduled other students, wanting her exclusively to himself. During flights, he pushed her to increasingly dangerous maneuvers, both of them getting high on the risk. "You're mine," he'd growl, his grip leaving marks. "No one else can have you like this." Aria matched his intensity, becoming equally obsessed. She cancelled plans with friends, spent every free moment at the academy. Their shared addiction to flying and each other created a volatile mixture of adrenaline and desire. "Show me you own me," she'd challenge him deliberately. "Make me feel it." Their flying became reckless. They'd buzz other aircraft too closely, perform prohibited maneuvers at unsafe altitudes. Alexander's reputation began suffering. Other instructors noticed his erratic behavior, his obsession with his young student. He'd have violent outbursts when male instructors spoke to her, his jealousy becoming impossible to hide. Anonymous complaints started appearing on the academy director's desk. Staff reported Alexander's threatening behavior, his inappropriate possessiveness. During one incident, he nearly assaulted a young instructor who'd offered to help Aria with her radio procedures. "You don't need anyone else," he raged afterward in his office. "I'm the only one who understands you, the only one who can teach you properly." Aria became isolated, speaking only to Alexander. Their world narrowed to just them, their shared obsession pushing away everything else. During flights, their radio chatter became intimate, inappropriate. They'd switch to private frequencies, their communications filled with passionate promises and possessive claims. The Academy's golden instructor and his star pupil were spiraling out of control. Alexander installed tracking software on Aria's phone, appeared unexpectedly when she was running errands, called constantly to check her whereabouts. His behavior became increasingly erratic, one moment tender, the next explosively jealous. "We're poisoned together," he whispered one night as they lay tangled in the cockpit of his private aircraft. But I can't stop. Then don't, she replied, pulling him closer. Never stop. Their reckless flying reached new heights. During one training session, they buzzed the control tower so closely that 3 separate complaints were filed. Alexander's response to the disciplinary meeting was to throw a chair across the room. The Academy's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Alexander's behavior had become a liability, his obsession with Aria obvious to everyone. But his reputation and long history with the Academy made them hesitate to take action. One evening, after a particularly dangerous training flight where they'd nearly crashed attempting an illegal maneuver, David, the senior instructor, confronted Alexander. This has to stop, he warned. You're going to kill someone, maybe yourself, maybe her. You need help, Drake. Alexander's response was immediate and violent. The fight that ensued left David with a broken nose and Alexander barred from the Academy for 2 weeks. But even this suspension couldn't keep him away. He'd park outside the Academy, watching Aria's every move, calling her constantly. When he returned, his behavior was even more unstable. He'd alternate between intense passion and dark paranoia, accusing Aria of betraying him with other instructors. Their encounters became rougher, more desperate, both of them lost in a darkness they couldn't escape. You're all I have, he told her obsessively. I won't let anyone take you from me. The Academy was in chaos. Students requested transfers, staff threatened to quit. Alexander's reputation lay in ruins, but he didn't care. His world had narrowed to Aria, possessing her, controlling her, keeping her. Everything else was falling apart, but they remained locked in their toxic dance, pushing each other to new extremes. Every flight became a death-defying act, every encounter a dangerous game of possession and submission. They were racing toward disaster, but neither could stop. Until the day Catherine Mitchell walked into Drake Academy, and their world exploded. Catherine Mitchell hadn't planned on coming to Drake Flight Academy. Her daughter's enthusiasm about her amazing instructor had been grating on her nerves for months, but it was a random social media post that finally drew her here. A photo of Aria in front of an aircraft, her instructor's arm around her shoulders. Something about his smile, his stance. She'd spent the morning going through old photos, comparing them to the Academy's website. Each image made her blood run colder. The resemblance was undeniable. Alexander Drake was Alexander Mitchell, the man who'd abandoned her 23 years ago, never knowing he had a daughter. Her hands trembled as she parked outside the Academy. She hadn't told Aria she was coming, hadn't warned anyone. The way her daughter talked about her instructor, the glow in her voice. Catherine's stomach churned as pieces started falling into place. When she walked into Alexander's office, 23 years of anger turned to ice in her veins. He looked older, but those eyes, the same eyes she saw in her daughter's face, widened in recognition. Hello, Alexander. Her voice shook. We need to talk about Aria. His coffee cup shattered on the floor. She watched his face, seeing the moment realization hit him. The horror dawning in his eyes confirmed her worst fears. No, he whispered. No, it's not possible. Catherine's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, showing him a baby picture of Aria. The daughter you left before she was born. Her voice cracked as the final, horrifying truth spilled out. The student you've been fucking. She hadn't meant to say it so brutally, but the signs had been there in Aria's calls. The secret tone in her voice when speaking about her instructor, the late-night training sessions, the glow of new love. Catherine had dismissed it, never imagining this nightmare. Alexander collapsed into his chair, trembling violently. You're lying, he managed, but the guilt and horror in his eyes told a different story. The door opened, and Catherine's heart stopped. Aria stood there, cheeks flushed, wearing a flight jacket that was too big for her, Alexander's jacket. The intimate gesture made Catherine's stomach heave. Mom! Aria's confusion was painful to watch. What are you doing here? Catherine's carefully planned words vanished. He's your father, Aria. The truth burst out like a weapon. The man you've been sleeping with is your father. Watching her daughter's face transform was like watching a slow-motion catastrophe. Horror crept across her features as understanding dawned. Catherine saw the moment memories started flashing behind Aria's eyes. Intimate memories that no mother should have to imagine. Aria doubled over, retching violently. No, no, no. She backed away, hitting the wall. It's not true. Please, Mom, tell me it's not true. Catherine moved to protect her daughter, but Alexander was already advancing, his face twisted in a manic grin. Aria, baby. Don't call me that. Aria's scream would haunt Catherine forever. Her daughter slid down the wall, body convulsing with sobs and heaves. Alexander's breakdown was explosive. My baby, he kept repeating, laughing hysterically. My beautiful baby girl. His laughter turned to screams as he lunged toward them. Stay away from her. Catherine placed herself between them, but Alexander was beyond reason. I love her, he screamed, fighting against the security staff who'd rushed in. She's mine. My student, my lover, my daughter. Catherine held her sobbing daughter, watching in horror as Alexander continued his manic breakdown. Each declaration of love, each mention of their relationship, made Aria convulse harder with horror. Get him out of here, Catherine ordered, her voice breaking. Someone call an ambulance. As security dragged Alexander away, his mad laughter echoing through the halls, Catherine cradled her daughter's shaking form. 23 years ago, she'd lost Alexander to his cowardice. Now she was losing her daughter to his madness, their lives shattering under the weight of this unthinkable truth. Aria remained curled on the floor, trapped in her nightmarish memories, while Alexander's voice carried back to them. My baby girl, my beautiful baby girl. The words, once tender, now dripped with horror. Catherine held her daughter tighter, her own shock and revulsion mixing with a mother's desperate need to protect. She'd come here seeking answers, only to unleash a horror beyond imagination. Her ex-lover and her daughter, bound by passion and blood. A tragedy she'd never seen coming until it was too late. Alexander's escape from the academy was a blur of rage and madness. He drove aimlessly, tears blinding him, until he found a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The clerk didn't look twice at his disheveled appearance or the wild look in his eyes as he paid cash for a week. The first bottle of whiskey burned going down. He spread their photos across the bed, training photos, secret snapshots, images stolen from security cameras. His daughter, his lover, his destruction. Each sip of alcohol brought a new memory, her lips against his, her body responding to his touch, her passion in the cockpit. Now every memory was tainted with the knowledge that it was his own flesh and blood he'd corrupted. My beautiful girl, he whispered to the photos, tears dropping onto their smiling faces. He began writing in a notebook, his handwriting growing more erratic with each page. Love letters became death threats, passion transformed to rage. You were mine, he wrote, whiskey spilling across the words. You'll always be mine. No one else can have you now. Across town, in the hospital's psychiatric ward, Aria lay strapped to a bed. They'd had to sedate her after her third attempt to hurt herself. The first had been in the ambulance, trying to claw her own skin off. The second in the emergency room, lunging for a scalpel. The third, attempting to throw herself through a window. Even sedated, she couldn't escape the memories. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, not as her father, but as her lover. His hands on her body, his mouth on hers, their passionate encounters in hidden corners of the academy. Each memory now felt like acid in her mind. Get it off, she'd screamed earlier, scrubbing her skin raw in the hospital shower until nurses had to drag her out. Get him off me. The mirror in her room had been removed after she'd smashed it, trying to use the shards. She couldn't bear to see her own face, his eyes staring back at her, his features mixed with hers in a terrible reminder of their sin. Male doctors couldn't approach her. The sight of any man sent her into hysterics, memories of Alexander's touch making her vomit. She'd torn out her fore twice, seeing the bruises he'd left on her arms during their last passionate encounter, marks made by her own father's hands. Why? She kept asking between sobs. Why did it have to be him? In his motel room, Alexander started planning. The whiskey bottles multiplied as he mapped out the hospital's layout, wrote down staff schedules. His love for Aria had become something dark and twisted, a need to possess and destroy. "If I can't have you," he wrote in his journal, "no one will." Aria's therapist made no progress. She refused to talk, curling into a ball when anyone tried to discuss what happened. The only sounds she made were whimpers in her sleep, begging her father, her lover, to stop. They found her trying to swallow her medication all at once, pills spilling from her mouth as nurses rushed in. "I can't live with this," she cried as they pumped her stomach. "I can't live knowing what we did." Alexander taped their photos all over his motel room walls, creating a shrine to their forbidden love. He touched each image, remembering every moment, every touch, every sin. His mind fractured further with each passing hour, father and lover becoming a single, destructive force. "My baby," he whispered to their images. "My beautiful, perfect baby. We'll be together again soon." In the hospital, Aria screamed herself awake from another nightmare, the memory of her father's, her lover's, touch still burning on her skin. The nurses found her in the shower again, water scalding hot, scrubbing until she bled. "Make it stop," she begged anyone who would listen. "Please, just make it all stop." Alexander's escape from the academy was a blur of rage and madness. He drove aimlessly, tears blinding him, until he found a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The neon vacancy sign flickered like emergency lights against his windshield, matching the chaos in his mind. The clerk didn't look twice at his disheveled appearance or the wild look in his eyes as he paid cash for a week. The first bottle of whiskey burned going down. He spread their photos across the bed, training photos, secret snapshots, images stolen from security cameras. His hands trembled as he arranged them chronologically, telling their story from first meeting to last passion. Each image now held a double horror: his lover, his student, his daughter. His sin made flesh. "My beautiful girl," he whispered to the photos, tears dropping onto their smiling faces. In one image, they stood together beside his favorite aircraft, his arm around her waist. He remembered taking that photo, remembered how she turned and kissed him right after, their passion igniting right there on the tarmac. The whiskey bottle emptied as he began writing in a notebook, his handwriting growing more erratic with each page. Love letters became death threats, passion transformed to rage. "You were mine," he wrote, alcohol spilling across the words. "You'll always be mine. No one else can have you now." His pilot's logbook lay open, entries detailing every flight they'd shared. He'd noted the weather, the maneuvers practiced, but between the lines lay their real story: first touches in the cockpit, passionate encounters after landing, love made in hidden hangars. Each entry now read like a confession of his sins. Across town, in the hospital's psychiatric ward, Aria lay strapped to a bed, her wrists bandaged from her latest attempt to destroy herself. They'd had to sedate her after her third suicide attempt. The first had been in the ambulance, trying to claw her own skin off, screaming that she could still feel his touch. The second in the emergency room, lunging for a scalpel when she caught her reflection in a medical tray. The third, attempting to throw herself through a window after a male nurse's hand accidentally brushed her arm. Even heavily sedated, she couldn't escape the memories. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, not as her father, but as her lover. His hands on her body, his mouth on hers, their passionate encounters in hidden corners of the academy. Each memory now felt like acid burning through her mind. "Get it off," she'd screamed earlier, scrubbing her skin raw in the hospital shower until nurses had to drag her out. "Get him off me. Get him out." Her nails had left bloody tracks down her arms, trying to erase the memory of his touch. The mirror in her room had been removed after she'd smashed it, trying to use the shards to cut away what she called his parts of me. She couldn't bear to see her own face, his eyes staring back at her, his features mixed with hers in a terrible reminder of their sin. Every glimpse of her reflection brought a new wave of horror. Male doctors couldn't approach her. The sight of any man sent her into hysterics, memories of Alexander's touch making her vomit. She'd torn out her fore twice, seeing the bruises he'd left on her arms during their last passionate encounter, marks made by her own father's hands. Each bruise told a story she couldn't bear to remember. Why? She kept asking between sobs. Why did it have to be him? Why did I love him so much? In his motel room, Alexander started planning. The whiskey bottles multiplied as he mapped out the hospital's layout, wrote down staff schedules. His love for Aria had become something dark and twisted, a need to possess and destroy. He taped their photos all over the walls, creating a shrine to their forbidden love. If I can't have you, he wrote in his journal, pages filled with increasingly disturbed ramblings, no one will. You're my blood, my soul, my sin. We'll fly together one last time. Flight manuals lay scattered around him, pages torn out and pasted into his journal. He'd circled words obsessively: stall, spin, crash, death spiral. His instructor notes about Aria were everywhere. Professional observations mixed with lover's praise, now tainted with a father's pride. Aria's therapist made no progress. She refused to talk, curling into a ball when anyone tried to discuss what happened. The only sounds she made were whimpers in her sleep, begging her father, her lover, to stop. Sometimes she'd wake up aroused from dreams of their passion, only to vomit when full consciousness brought understanding. They found her trying to swallow her medication all at once, pills spilling from her mouth as nurses rushed in. I can't live with this, she cried as they pumped her stomach. I can't live knowing what we did. Every time I close my eyes, I feel him. Every time I breathe, I smell him. He's in my blood, in my bones. I need him out. Alexander touched each photo on his wall, remembering every moment, every touch, every sin. His mind fractured further with each passing hour, father and lover becoming a single, destructive force. He wrote love poems that turned into murder notes halfway through, drew pictures of aircraft that transformed into weapons. My baby, he whispered to their images. My beautiful, perfect baby. We'll be together again soon. No one else can understand our love. No one else can have you. In the hospital, Aria screamed herself awake from another nightmare. The memory of her father's, her lover's, touch still burning on her skin. The nurses found her in the shower again, water scalding hot, scrubbing until she bled. Make it stop, she begged anyone who would listen. Please, just make it all stop. I loved him so much. I still love him. How can I still love him? What's wrong with me? Both father and daughter, lover and beloved, descended into their private hells. Their once perfect love corrupted into something monstrous. Each passing hour drove them further into darkness, him toward violence, her toward self-destruction. Their parallel breakdowns spiraled toward an inevitable, tragic end. Days bled into nights in Alexander's motel room. Empty bottles covered every surface, takeout containers growing mold in corners. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and whiskey fumes, but he didn't notice anymore. His world had narrowed to the photos covering his walls. You looked so beautiful that day, he'd whisper to an image of Aria in the cockpit. The way you handled the controls, like you were born to fly. My blood in your veins. He'd touch the photo, then take another drink. My perfect girl. My sin. My destruction. His journals grew more disturbing. Flight lesson plans transformed into romantic fantasies, then twisted into violent obsessions. Today we practice stalls. One entry began professionally, then devolved. The way she gasped when we dropped, her body against mine in the cockpit. My daughter. My lover. Mine to love. Mine to destroy. Old training videos played on his laptop constantly. He'd freeze frames of their moments together, tracing her features on the screen. You have my eyes, he'd murmur. My hands. My passion for flight. Sometimes he'd rage at the images, screaming about betrayal. Other times he'd weep, begging forgiveness from the frozen frames. The roles of father and lover merged in his fevered mind. He'd write letters addressing my beautiful daughter that turned into passionate love notes, then morphed into death threats. Each page was stained with tears, whiskey, and increasingly violent drawings of aircraft crashes. In the hospital, Aria's condition deteriorated. Night terrors ripped through her sedation, her screams echoing down sterile hallways. Daddy, please, She'd cry, then vomit as she woke, realizing her nightmares mixed terror with pleasure. The sight of aircraft overhead sent her into panic attacks. During one therapy session, a plane's shadow passed over the window, and she collapsed, hyperventilating. "I can feel him," she gasped. "In the cockpit. His hands. Teaching me. Loving me. Oh God. Make it stop." Trust became impossible. Every male figure became a threat, every touch a reminder. She saw Alexander in every corner, heard his instructor's voice in every man's words. Even female nurses had to announce themselves repeatedly before approaching. "I thought he was perfect," she told her therapist during a rare moment of clarity. "The perfect instructor. The perfect lover. And now," she retched into a basin. "Now I know he's my father, but I still..." She couldn't finish, shame and disgust overwhelming her. Suicidal thoughts became her constant companion. She'd stare at ceiling tiles, calculating load weights like he'd taught her, but now measuring their capacity to hold a makeshift noose. Every object became a potential escape: shoelaces, sheets, paper clips. The hospital staff watched her constantly, but they couldn't protect her from her own mind. "I can't exist like this," she whispered to her reflection in the window. "Half him, half me. His blood, his sin." Her forehead pressed against the cold glass. "Daddy, Alexander, why couldn't you have just been one person? Why did you have to be both?" Alexander's car became his new cockpit, parked in shadows outside the hospital. His camera lens replaced his flight instruments, documenting every movement as Aria was finally released. Through the viewfinder, he watched her walk to Catherine's car, noticed how she looked over her shoulder constantly, sensed danger like an animal being hunted. "Still so beautiful," he whispered, clicking away. "So graceful, even in fear. Just like when you flew." His hands trembled with need. Father's love and lover's desire twisted into something monstrous. He began leaving messages everywhere. Notes under her windshield wipers. "I miss teaching you." Texts from burner phones. "The sky misses us." Voicemails that started tender and ended in rage. "You're mine, baby girl. Daddy loves you. I'll kill you before I let anyone else have you." His stalking became bolder. He'd follow her to therapy appointments, watching through windows as she curled into herself on the counselor's couch. At night, he'd stand outside her bedroom window, seeing her toss in nightmare-plagued sleep. Each observation fed his obsession, his parental protectiveness warping into predatory hunger. "You can't escape me," he scrawled on her car in red paint. "We're bound by blood and passion. Forever." Aria lived in constant terror. Every shadow held her father's shape. Every strange noise carried echoes of his voice. She'd check her locks repeatedly, push furniture against doors, but nothing kept out the memories or the fear. His messages made her physically ill. Each one triggered fresh waves of horror. The loving instructor, the passionate lover, the father she'd never known, all merging into a monster that haunted her every moment. "He's there," she'd whisper to her therapist, pointing at empty corners. "Watching me. Always watching. Like in the cockpit, when he taught me. When he..." She'd retch, unable to finish. Sleep became impossible. She'd jerk awake from dreams where loving flights turned into violent attacks, her father's instructive touch becoming something deadly. Dark circles grew under her eyes as paranoia consumed her. Alexander's obsession grew more violent. His photos now included detailed notes about security systems, window locks, entry points. His journal entries became explicit murder plans, each scenario mixing death with passion, paternal love with sexual possession. "Soon," he wrote, surrounded by photos of her. "Soon we'll have our last flight together. Just daddy and his baby girl." Aria descended into total depression. "I can't live like this," she told Catherine. "He's everywhere. In my head, in my blood, in my memories. Every time I close my eyes, I feel him teaching me to fly, touching me, loving me." She broke down. "I want to die. Please, just let me die." Alexander watched it all through his lens, his madness growing with each click of the shutter. Father and lover and killer merged into one entity, focused solely on claiming his daughter one final time. Alexander sat in his motel room, the gun cold and heavy in his hands. Photos of Aria surrounded him, as a baby, as his student, as his lover. His mind flickered between roles like a faulty landing light. Daughter, student, lover, victim. My beautiful girl, he whispered, taking another drink. His last bottle of whiskey was almost empty. Daddy's coming to take you on one final flight. He wrote his last note with shaking hands. To my daughter, my student, my love, we were meant to fly together. Now we'll fall together. The words blurred as tears mixed with whiskey stains on the paper. Checking his weapon again, Alexander's instructor's precision warred with paternal tenderness and lover's passion. Each bullet he loaded carried a different meaning. Father's protection, lover's possession, killer's intent. Across town, Aria paced her apartment, jumping at shadows. She'd called her mother earlier, voice shaking. I feel him watching. Like in the cockpit, when he'd watch me handle the controls. But different now. Deadly. Her last journal entry lay open. I still love him. The instructor who taught me to soar. The man who made me feel alive. How can I love the father who destroyed me? Please, let me sleep without dreams tonight. Sleep medication blurred her vision as she curled up in bed. Her father's flight jacket, once her lover's comfort, lay hidden in her closet, his scent still lingering. As consciousness faded, she didn't hear the lock being picked. Alexander entered silently, years of aircraft maintenance lending precision to his movements. Moonlight filtered through curtains she'd forgotten to close, illuminating her sleeping form. He stood watching, remembering her first solo flight, their first kiss, the daughter he'd never known. His hand reached out, touching her hair softly. So beautiful, he whispered. Just like in the cockpit. Past and present merged, teaching her to fly, loving her in secret, the horror of discovery. Rage began building as memories tortured him. Aria stirred, some primitive instinct sensing danger. Her eyes fluttered open, sleep medication making everything hazy. Then she saw him, her instructor, her lover, her father, standing over her bed. Alexander, she whispered. Daddy. The words tangled together, both roles impossible to separate. Terror cut through the medication's fog. She tried to move, but her body felt leaden. Please, she whispered, seeing the weapon in his hand. We can talk about this. Shish, he soothed, like he used to during rough turbulence. Daddy's here. Your instructor's here. Your lover's here. His grip tightened on the gun. We're all here to take you on your final flight. Aria saw the madness in his eyes, her eyes, their shared legacy. Understanding dawned with horrible clarity. This was their final lesson, their last passionate encounter, their ultimate blood bond. I loved you, she whispered, tears falling. All of you. I know, baby girl, Alexander replied, raising the weapon. That's why we have to end this dance. Together. I loved you, Aria whispered, tears falling. All of you. Something snapped in Alexander's mind at those words. Love. All of him. Father. Instructor. Lover. The roles crashed together in his psyche like aircraft colliding mid-air. You can't love all of me, he screamed, his composure shattering. You can't love your father like you loved your lover. The gun shook in his hand as he lunged forward, grabbing her hair. You can't love the man who taught you to fly like you love the man who gave you life. Aria fought against the medication's fog, trying to scramble away. Please, Daddy, don't, she caught herself. Alexander, please, but that was wrong too. Every name was wrong. Every role was wrong. His free hand stroked her face. A lover's caress turned violent. Remember our first kiss, he whispered, then suddenly slammed her head against the headboard. Remember how Daddy taught you to soar? Another slam. Remember how we made love in the cockpit? Stop. Aria managed to break free, falling to the floor. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. She tried crawling away, but her movements were sluggish from the sleeping pills. Alexander's laugh was hysterical. But I did know, didn't I? Somewhere deep down, I must have known. You flew just like me. You had my eyes, my hands, my passion. He kicked her onto her back, straddling her. You were mine in every way possible. Aria saw death in his eyes, their shared curse. She fought back, scratching, hitting, but her strength was fading. I was your daughter, she gasped. Your student. Never meant to be more. But you were more. His hands found her throat. You were everything. My blood, my passion, my sin. Tears fell from his eyes onto her face as he squeezed. And now you'll be my final lesson. Through darkening vision, Aria saw their memories flash. First flight lesson. First kiss. First passion. Last truth. Father. Instructor. Lover. Killer. All merging into this final moment. I forgive you, she managed to whisper, her last gift to him. The words shattered his last grip on sanity. With an animalistic howl, Alexander pulled the trigger. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each bullet carrying a different love. Fathers. Teachers. Lovers. As Aria's blood spread across her bedroom floor, Alexander gathered her in his arms, rocking her like a child, kissing her like a lover, teaching her about death like an instructor. Fly with me one last time, baby girl, he whispered, stroking her hair as police sirens wailed in the distance. Daddy's here. Your lover's here. We'll soar together into darkness. He was still holding her, laughing and crying, whispering flight instructions mixed with love poems and lullabies, when the police broke down the door.